The compass that shouldn't exist, a device built from nothing at 2:17 a.m. on September 23, 1944, deep inside a forest so dense it swallowed moonlight whole. Staff Sergeant James Thompson sat half-exposed in the commander's hatch of his M4 Sherman tank, staring at something that should not have existed on a battlefield, something no manual had ever mentioned, something no officer had ever approved, something that, by every standard of military engineering, was completely absurd. It was a shaving mirror glued to a scrap of cardboard, a magnetized sewing needle trembling on top of a pencil eraser, bits of string and tape barely holding the fragile construction together, the entire thing looking more like a child's science experiment than a tool meant to guide armored vehicles through enemy territory. And yet, in that moment, in that suffocating darkness, this crude invention carried more weight than any weapon in the convoy, because 12 tanks and 63 men were about to trust their lives to it. The official compasses had failed, every single one of them, just 20 minutes earlier, their needles spinning wildly as if possessed, refusing to settle, refusing to point anywhere meaningful. Thompson had watched it happen in disbelief at first, tapping the glass, turning the housing, checking again and again as if repetition alone might fix the problem, but it hadn't. None of them worked anymore. Not the commander's lensatic compass, not the driver's backup, not even the spare units stored in equipment kits. They were blind, completely blind, and worse than that, they were lost. The forest around them, what the maps called the Hürtgen region, felt alive in a way that made the skin crawl. The trees rose like black pillars into a ceiling of branches so thick that not even the faintest starlight could penetrate. There were no landmarks, no visible terrain features, nothing to orient by. Just darkness, endless and oppressive, broken only by the low rumble of idling engines and the occasional metallic creak of cooling armor. Somewhere in that darkness, German forces controlled the roads, the bridges, the open ground. Somewhere out there, patrols were moving, listening, watching. And if they found this column, the outcome wouldn't be a battle, it would be a slaughter. Behind Thompson, 11 other Sherman tanks waited on a narrow logging road that had ended abruptly at the remains of a destroyed bridge. The mission had already gone wrong hours ago. What had started as a reconnaissance push through a supposed gap in German defenses had turned into a nightmare scenario, deep penetration into enemy territory with no support, no communication, and now, no way to navigate out. Radio silence had been ordered after crossing the lanes, a smart move under normal circumstances because German direction-finding units could locate transmissions in minutes. But now that silence felt like isolation, like abandonment. No one knew where they were. No one was coming to help. Thompson tightened his grip on the homemade compass, his hand shaking not from the cold, but from the realization of what it meant. This wasn't a backup plan. This wasn't even a plan. It was desperation shaped into a tool. He had built it weeks earlier out of boredom, something to pass time during a lull, never imagining it would be used for anything serious. The crew had laughed at it. Even he had laughed at it. But now, it was the only thing that hadn't failed. The needle trembled, pointing in a direction that felt uncertain, almost hesitant, as if it too understood the weight of the moment. North, maybe, or slightly northeast. It was hard to tell, with adrenaline tightening his vision and his pulse pounding in his ears. Behind him, the engines of 11 tanks idled like restrained beasts, each one carrying men who were waiting for a decision that would determine whether they lived or died before sunrise. And sunrise was coming, fast. 3 hours until dawn. Captain Morrison's voice broke the silence over the intercom, low and controlled, but carrying an urgency that needed no explanation. The bridge is gone. All compasses are dead. We need another way out now. 15 words. That was all it took to turn a bad situation into a desperate one. Thompson didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on the needle, watching its slight, almost nervous movements as if he could will it into certainty. 3 hours and 40 minutes. That's how long they had until dawn, maybe less. And once the sun came up, the forest would no longer hide them. German patrols would sweep through the area. Supply routes would come alive. 12 American tanks sitting in the middle of enemy territory would be impossible to miss. He did the math in his head, the way soldiers learn to do under pressure. If they moved in the wrong direction, they would drive deeper into German-controlled territory, burn through their fuel, and eventually be surrounded. If they stayed where they were, the result would be the same, just laid. There was no safe option. There was only a choice between risks. Captain Morrison climbed up onto the turret, his boots scraping softly against the metal. Even in the darkness, his presence was steady, grounded. He had a way of making impossible situations feel manageable, not because he downplayed the danger, but because he faced it head-on. He looked down at the makeshift compass in Thompson's hand, his expression unreadable. "How sure are you?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it carried everything behind it: trust, responsibility, consequence. Thompson could have lied. He could have said 80%, 90%, anything to sound more confident, to make the decision easier. But this was Morrison, a man who had dragged him out of a burning vehicle weeks earlier, a man who had told him the truth when his brother was killed. This wasn't someone you lied to, 60%, Thompson said. For a moment, there was only silence. 5 seconds that felt like an eternity. Then Morrison nodded once decisively. That's better odds than staying here. And just like that, the decision was made. The column would move. What followed wasn't part of any training doctrine. It wasn't something taught at Fort Knox or written in any field manual. Tank crews were trained for coordinated assaults, for advancing with infantry support, for engaging enemy armor in open terrain. They were not trained to navigate blindly through dense forest at night using a device made from scrap materials. And yet, that was exactly what they were about to do. Morrison began issuing silent hand signals relayed down the line from tank to tank. Formation, column, interval 20 yards, no lights, no radio chatter, absolute silence unless contact was made. Thompson's tank would lead. Every other vehicle would follow his movements precisely. If he stopped, they stopped. If he turned, they turned. 63 men placing their lives in the hands of one direction and one fragile needle. Thompson climbed down into position, his heart still hammering, but something had shifted. The fear was still there, but it had hardened into focus. This was no longer about out, it was about execution. He keyed the intercom. Driver, get ready. We're moving northwest. There was a pause, then Webb's voice came back, tight but controlled. How do you know it's northwest? Thompson looked at the compass one more time, the needle steady now, pointing into the darkness. Because this says so. Another pause. Then Webb replied, half joking, half dead serious. If we die because of that thing, I'm coming back to haunt you. Under different circumstances, Thompson might have laughed, but not tonight. At 2:41 a.m., the lead Sherman lurched forward, its treads biting into the soft forest floor, the sound of its engine suddenly feeling far too loud in the silence. One by one, the other 11 tanks followed, disappearing into the darkness behind him. The column had begun to move, and with it, the thin line between survival and disaster. The forest that broke compasses, where direction dies the moment Thompson's Sherman tank moved forward. Something invisible but irreversible shifted in the minds of every man in the column, because movement meant commitment, and commitment meant there was no turning back, no second attempt, no safe pause to reconsider the decision. Only a slow and deliberate push deeper into darkness that seemed almost alive, pressing in from every direction as if the forest itself were closing around them. The Hürtgen Forest was not just dense, it was suffocating, a place where the trees grew so tightly together that even the faintest moonlight failed to reach the ground, turning the world into a shapeless black void where distance lost meaning and direction became something you felt rather than saw. Thompson stood in the commander's hatch with one hand gripping the cold steel of the turret and the other holding a fragile homemade compass close enough to read its trembling needle through the reflection of the small mirror, because he couldn't afford to look down for more than a second at a time, couldn't afford to lose sight of the terrain ahead where every root, every fallen branch, every hidden crater could stop the tank or worse, trap it completely. The device in his hand felt absurd, even now, a shaving mirror glued to cardboard, a sewing needle balanced on a pencil eraser, bits of string holding it together, but it was the only thing that hadn't failed them, the only thing still offering any sense of direction in a place where direction itself seemed to be breaking apart. The ground ahead rose unevenly, scarred by years of artillery bombardment that had turned sections of the forest into a chaotic maze of debris and unstable earth. And Thompson signaled a slight adjustment, his hand moving just enough for Webb to understand, the Sherman shifting a few degrees to the left before correcting back toward the intended heading, and behind them 11 other tanks mirrored the movement with disciplined precision, each crew trusting completely in the silhouette ahead that they could barely see, following not because they were certain, but because there was no other choice. The real danger, however, wasn't what they could see in front of them, but what lay beneath and around them, hidden in the soil and the shattered remains of previous battles, because the Hürtgen Forest sat on a disturbed magnetic landscape where iron deposits, buried shells, scattered shrapnel, and rusting wreckage combined into something far more dangerous than enemy fire, a field of interference that twisted and disrupted the natural pull of the Earth's magnetism. That was why the standard military compasses had failed so completely, their precision becoming their weakness as the metal housings and finely balanced mechanisms reacted to the distorted field, amplifying it, causing the needles to spin uncontrollably without ever settling on a true direction, turning reliable instruments into useless pieces of equipment in a matter of minutes. Thompson's crude compass survived for the exact opposite reason: it lacked everything that made the official instruments sophisticated. Its weakly magnetized needle responding slowly rather than violently, its rubber base creating just enough friction to prevent uncontrolled spinning, its almost complete absence of surrounding metal, allowing it to sense the distorted magnetic field without amplifying it into chaos. It wasn't accurate in the traditional sense, but it was stable, and in that moment stability was more valuable than precision, because even an imperfect direction was better than none at all. Still, the doubt remained, quietly pressing against Thompson's thoughts as he guided the column forward. because consistency did not guarantee truth, and the needle pointing northwest could just as easily be leading them deeper into danger as it could be guiding them toward safety. A sudden snap of a branch somewhere off to the right cut through the steady hum of engines, freezing Thompson instantly as his hand rose in a silent signal, the Sherman halting and the rest of the column stopping behind it in a chain reaction of disciplined silence, engines dropping to a low idle as every man listened, straining to separate real sound from imagined threat. The voices that followed were faint but unmistakable German, casual, unhurried, the tone of men who felt secure in their surroundings, who had no reason to expect enemy armor sitting hidden in the darkness less than 100 yards away. Thompson lowered himself slightly, reducing his silhouette, his breathing slowing by force as his heart hammered in his chest, each second stretching unbearably as the voices drifted closer and then slowly faded away. The danger passing not because of anything they had done, but because of sheer luck, because the enemy had no idea they were there. When the forest returned to silence, Thompson gave the signal to move again, and the column pushed forward once more, but the feeling had changed now. The forest no longer just an obstacle to navigate, but something far more dangerous, something that concealed threats in every direction and offered no clear path out. Time lost its normal meaning as they advanced, measured not in minutes but in distance gained and fuel consumed, each yard forward carrying a cost that could not be recovered, because these tanks were never meant for this kind of movement, never designed to crawl blindly through dense forest terrain where speed was impossible, and every obstacle forced a deviation from the intended path. Thompson checked his watch briefly, 2:49 a.m., but the number felt irrelevant compared to the growing awareness that dawn was approaching, and with it the end of whatever protection darkness provided. With every turn, every correction features introduced a small error, and those errors accumulated with every turn, every correction, every deviation, pulling them slightly off course in ways that could not be measured or corrected in real time. Small ones that slowly led you somewhere you never intended killed you, but the accumulation of small ones that slowly led you somewhere you never intended to go. Inside the tank, the tension was building, not openly but in subtle ways, in the tightness of Webb's voice when he spoke, into mechanical checks that didn't need to be repeated, Diaz as he tried to channel nervous energy into mechanical checks that didn't need to be repeated, into silence that filled the spaces where conversation might have eased the pressure, but was now forbidden by necessity. At 2:53 a.m., the forest forced another decision as a stream cut across their path without warning. The dark water reflecting nothing, its depth impossible to judge at a glance, and Thompson climbed down into the mud to test it, the cold seeping through his boots as he measured roughly 3 feet. To cross, but still risky, because one mistake here could immobilize the lead tank and trap the entire column behind. Morrison's quiet question, "Can we cross?" hung in the air for a moment before Thompson answered yes, knowing that hesitation would only make things worse. And when the Sherman rolled into the water, the engine strained against the resistance, the tracks fighting for grip in the mud before finally climbing the opposite bank, followed one by the rest of the column, each tank repeating the same risky maneuver until all 12 had crossed without incident. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't, because the deeper they moved, the more fragile everything became, the margin for error shrinking with every passing minute. And when Webb finally spoke again at 3:21 a.m., his voice carrying a tension that was impossible to hide, the words confirmed what Thompson already knew but didn't want to face. The fuel gauge was at half. Half a tank might have sounded manageable under normal conditions, but here it meant limitation. It meant every wrong turn mattered, every unnecessary movement carried consequences, and every minute spent navigating uncertainty brought them closer to running out of time and fuel at the same moment. Thompson didn't answer right away because he didn't have an answer to give, didn't know how far they had come or how far they still needed to go, didn't know if the direction they were following was leading them towards safety or deeper into danger. And in the end, all he could say was the only thing that mattered: now keep moving, Beck, as stopping was no longer an option. Not in a forest where direction was unreliable. The enemy was everywhere, and the only path forward was the one they were already committed to following. The moment the compass betrayed them, when the needle began to lie by 3:21 a.m., the forest no longer felt like something they were moving through, it felt like something that was closing in. Tightening its grip with every yard, the column advanced, and for the first time since they had started moving, Thompson felt a crack in his certainty. Not because anything had visibly gone wrong, but because everything had remained just stable enough for too long, and in a place like this, stability itself began to feel suspicious. The needle on his homemade compass had held steady on a northwest bearing for nearly an hour, guiding 12 Sherman tanks through terrain that should have broken them apart. And yet that very consistency began to plant doubt in his mind, because nothing else in this forest behaved predictably. Not the ground, not the sound, not even the air that seemed to carry distant noises in unnatural ways. He checked the compass again, tilting it slightly to catch the reflection in the mirror, watching the thin steel needle quiver almost imperceptibly, and for a brief moment he wondered if he had been too quick to trust it, if he had allowed desperation to turn a crude tool into something he believed was reliable, simply because he needed it to be. Behind him, the column moved in disciplined silence, 11 tanks following his path exactly, their crews unaware of the growing uncertainty inside the lead vehicle, because doubt was something that could not be shared without consequence. If Thompson questioned the compass out loud, it would ripple through the column instantly, turning tension into hesitation, hesitation into mistakes, and mistakes into disaster. Leadership in moments like this wasn't about being certain, it was about appearing certain even when certainty didn't exist. He knew that, he had lived that, but knowing it didn't make the weight any lighter. The terrain began to change subtly, the dense clusters of trees thinning just enough to allow faint streaks of gray light to filter through the canopy. Not enough to illuminate the ground, but enough to distort perception, creating shadows that moved when nothing else did, shapes that looked like obstacles until they vanished at the last second. The ground under the treads shifted from soft soil to a mix of rock and packed dirt, the sound of movement becoming sharper, louder, more distinct, and with that change came a new problem: noise that could travel farther, noise that could betray their position to anyone within range. Thompson raised his hand slightly, signaling a reduction in speed, and the tank responded immediately, slowing just enough to maintain control without drawing unnecessary attention. But even that small adjustment added time, and time was something they were rapidly running out of. At 3:28 a.m., the first real sign of failure appeared. It was subtle at first, almost easy to miss. A slight hesitation in the needle's movement when Thompson adjusted the angle of the compass, a delay that hadn't been there before. And for a moment he thought it might be his imagination, the result of fatigue or stress, or the constant pressure of decision-making under uncertainty. Side of the cardboard lightly, a reflex more than a deliberate action, and the needle responded with a small, uneven twitch before settling again northwest. The same direction it had been pointing since they started, the same direction he had trusted without question, but now it didn't feel the same. He watched it longer this time, holding it steady, his eyes narrowing slightly as he focused on the tiniest movements, and that was when he saw the oscillation, barely noticeable but undeniably there. A slow drift a few degrees to the left, then back to the right, not spinning wildly like the failed military compasses, but not stable either. It was searching, uncertain, reacting to something unseen. Thompson felt a cold weight settle in his chest, the realization forming before he could fully process it. The compass wasn't stable anymore. The one thing they had relied on, the one thing that had worked, was starting to fail. He didn't stop the column immediately. He couldn't. Stopping meant admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty at this point could be as dangerous as moving in the wrong direction. Instead, he made a slight correction, adjusting their heading as if everything was still under control. As if the change in the needle meant nothing, but inside his mind calculations were already racing, trying to determine what this meant. Trying to find a pattern where none existed, stronger magnetic anomaly, or leaving the one they had been in, trying to find a pattern where none existed. Then the needle moved again, more noticeably this time, 5 degrees left, then 5 degrees right, back and forth, not settling, not choosing. Thompson's grip tightened around the compass, his fingers pressing harder than necessary, as if physical pressure could force the needle into obedience. But it didn't respond, continuing its slow, uncertain oscillation. And in that moment, the fragile sense of control he had built over the past hour began to fracture. He raised his hand sharply, signaling a stop, and the Sherman halted, followed seconds later by the rest of the column, the sudden stillness feeling heavier than any movement they had made so far. Morrison's voice came through almost immediately, low but edged with urgency. "Why are we stopping?" Thompson didn't answer right away. He couldn't, not until he understood what he was seeing, not until he could form something that sounded like a reason instead of a fear. He stared at the needle, willing it to stabilize, willing it to return to the steady direction it had held for so long. But it continued to waver, drifting back and forth as if caught between conflicting forces. Finally, he keyed the radio. "The compass, it's acting strange. Give me 2 minutes. 2 minutes. It sounded reasonable. It felt impossible. Because in those 2 minutes, everything hung in balance: their direction, their survival, the trust of 62 other men who had followed him this far without question. And now, for the first time, he didn't know if he could keep leading them. A direction that changed everything. The forest was silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt heavier, charged with tension that had nowhere to go, as every crew in every tank waited without understanding why they had stopped, sensing only that something was wrong, something that couldn't be seen but was significant enough to halt an entire column in the middle of enemy territory. Thompson kept his eyes locked on the compass, watching the needle as if it might reveal its intentions if he focused hard enough, but it offered nothing except uncertainty, the slow, uneven shifting that made it impossible to trust. He pulled out the map with his free hand, spreading it awkwardly across the turret, using the dim red filtered light from Morrison's flashlight to estimate their position, but the calculation felt hollow from the start because it relied on assumptions that were no longer reliable: distance traveled, direction maintained. Deviations corrected, all variables that had been compromised by the very problem they were now facing. If they had truly been moving northwest for the past 47 minutes at an average speed of 2 miles per hour, they should have covered roughly 1.5 miles, maybe slightly more. But that estimate assumed straight-line movement, and nothing about their path had been straight. They had turned repeatedly, adjusted constantly, avoided obstacles, crossed uneven terrain. Each change introducing error that compounded over time, turning what should have been a simple calculation into something closer to guesswork. Thompson exhaled slowly, trying to steady his thoughts, trying to separate what he knew from what he only believed he knew, and the distinction between the two felt dangerously thin. Then at 3:31 a.m., the needle stopped moving. It didn't settle back to northwest. It didn't return to its previous heading. It shifted, and then it held, pointing directly north. Not slightly north, not approximately north. The change was immediate and undeniable, and for a moment Thompson just stared at it, unable to process what he was seeing, because it didn't make sense, because there was no gradual transition, no clear indication of why the direction had changed so suddenly after being stable for so long. It was as if the compass had simply decided that everything it had been showing them before was wrong, that the direction they had trusted for nearly an hour was no longer valid, and the implications of that realization hit harder than anything else that had happened that night. If the compass was correct now, then it had been wrong before, and if it had been wrong before, then they had been moving in the wrong direction the entire time. Morrison climbed up onto the turret again, his movements quick but controlled, and he looked at the compass without speaking at first, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the new heading. "What's happening?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Thompson admitted, the words feeling heavier than any he had spoken that night. "It changed. Could be we're out of the anomaly. Could be we're in a worse one. Could be this thing's finally giving out." None of those options were reassuring. None of them provided a clear path forward. Morrison looked past him, scanning the terrain ahead. And for the first time, there was something visible beyond the immediate darkness, a slight thinning of the trees. A suggestion of elevation rising in the distance. "That ridge," he said, pointing. "If we get up there, we might be able to see something. Landmarks, anything. It was a risk." Ridges offered visibility, but they also offered exposure, and climbing it would require more engine power, more noise, more chance of being detected. But staying where they were with an unreliable compass was worse. Thompson nodded once, the decision forming without needing further discussion, and he signaled the column to move again, this time toward the ridge instead of following the uncertain direction of the compass. The climb was slow and loud, the Sherman struggling against loose ground that forced Webb to push the engine harder than before, the noise breaking whatever concealment they had relied on until now, echoing through the forest in a way that felt impossible to hide. And Thompson found himself counting seconds unconsciously, waiting for the sound of return movement, for the distant rumble of German engines responding, for the unmistakable crack of incoming fire, but none came. Only their own noise filled the night as they pushed upward, every second increasing the risk, but also bringing them closer to something they desperately needed: clarity. When they reached the top at 3:46 a.m., Thompson rose slightly higher in the hatch, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead, and what he saw stopped him cold. Lights, not scattered, not distributed, dozens of them. A full encampment spread across a valley below, vehicles, tents, movement visible even in the dim pre-dawn light. The unmistakable layout of a German staging area sitting less than 2 miles away in the exact direction. The compass had been guiding them for nearly an hour. For a moment, everything else disappeared: the cold, the fear, the tension replaced by a single, overwhelming realization. If they had continued on that heading, they would have driven straight into it. Morrison saw it too, his reaction immediate but controlled, the shock evident even in the darkness. "The compass saved us," he said instinctively. Thompson shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed on the valley below. "No," he said, "it didn't." There was a pause, just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle. "It broke," Thompson continued quietly, "and that's what saved us, because if it hadn't failed, if it had stayed stable, if it had kept pointing northwest without wavering, they would already be dead." That realization changed everything, not just about the situation they were in, but about the tool they had trusted. Because it meant the compass wasn't just unreliable, it was unpredictable, capable of being right and wrong, in ways that couldn't be distinguished until it was too late. And yet, despite that, it was still all they had. Morrison unfolded the map again, using the German encampment as a reference point, recalculating their position with a precision that had been impossible before. "If that's their staging area," he said, "then we're here. which means friendly lines are northeast, not northwest. The original heading had been wrong, completely wrong. And the only reason they hadn't paid for that mistake was because the compass had failed at exactly the right moment. Thompson looked down at the needle again, now pointing steadily north, and for a brief moment he felt something close to disbelief, not at the situation, but at the thin line between survival and disaster that they had just crossed without even realizing it. 63 men had trusted a device that had been wrong, had followed it deep into enemy territory, and had only been saved because it stopped working when it mattered most. Morrison looked at him again. "Can it give us northeast?" Thompson hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I can estimate it. It wasn't confidence, it wasn't certainty, but it was enough because it had to be." And with that, the column prepared to move again, this time not following the compass blindly, but using it as one uncertain piece of a much larger gamble. A gamble that would have to carry them the rest of the way out of enemy territory before the rising sun exposed them completely. The escape through enemy lines, crossing the line between survival and death at 3:53 a.m. Thompson gave the signal to move again, and the column of 12 Sherman tanks began descending the far side of the ridge, turning away from the German encampment that had nearly become their grave without them ever realizing it. And for the first time since the night had begun, their movement carried a sense of direction grounded not just in instinct or fragile trust, but in observation, in something real that could be seen and mapped against the terrain. Still, that sense of clarity did not bring comfort, because now the stakes were fully understood. Now they knew exactly how close they had come to destruction, and that knowledge made every decision sharper, heavier, more immediate. Because there would be no second miracle if they made another mistake. The forest below the ridge opened slightly into a shallow valley, the trees thinning just enough to allow faint gray light from the approaching dawn to outline the terrain, but not enough to expose them completely. And that fragile balance between concealment and visibility became their only advantage as Thompson adjusted the columns heading toward the northeast, estimating the angle by splitting the difference between the compass needle pointing north and the direction he believed east lay based on the map Morrison had recalculated moments earlier. The descent was faster than their previous movement, gravity pulling the tanks forward as Webb carefully controlled the speed, the treads gripping uneven ground that threatened to slip under the weight of the vehicles, and for a brief stretch it almost felt like momentum was on their side, like they were finally gaining something instead of constantly fighting against the terrain. But that illusion didn't last, because the valley floor brought new obstacle-soft patches of mud, shallow depressions filled with water, fallen debris hidden in shadows, and each one forced adjustments, small corrections that once again introduced error into their path. Thompson kept glancing at the compass, no longer trusting it blindly but unable to ignore it either, using it as a reference point rather than a guide. His mind now working in layers, combining what the needle suggested with what the terrain revealed and what the map implied, creating a rough direction that felt more like educated guesswork than navigation. By 4:07 a.m., the trees began to thin more noticeably. And then, almost suddenly, the forest gave way to something that felt both like relief and danger at the same time, a road junction. It appeared out of the darkness as a clear break in the terrain, a stretch of compacted dirt and gravel cutting through the forest in two directions, one leading deeper into enemy-controlled territory, the other potentially offering a path towards safety. And for a moment, Thompson felt a surge of relief so strong it almost overwhelmed him, because this was the first recognizable feature they had encountered since the night began, the first confirmation that they were not completely lost. The map Morrison had studied indicated a junction in this general area, and seeing it now suggested that their estimated position might actually be close to reality, that despite the uncertainty, despite the failed compass and the countless deviations, they had somehow ended up near where they needed to be. But relief in a place like this never came without a cost. The moment the lead Sherman approached the edge of the road, Thompson heard it. A sound that cut through everything else. Metal on hard ground tracks, not theirs, German. The rhythm was unmistakable, a heavier, tighter mechanical cadence than the Sherman's, carrying through the still air with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Thompson raised his hand instantly. The signal passed back through the column in seconds as all 12 tanks came to a halt just short of the road, engines dropping to a low idle, every crew suddenly alert, listening, calculating. The sound was coming from the east, moving along the road toward the junction, and it was getting closer. Very close. Thompson's mind shifted instantly from navigation to survival, his senses narrowing as he focused entirely on the sound. The variations in engine tone, separating them the way experienced tank crews learned to do after months in combat. One engine deeper, heavier, another slightly higher pitch, a third distinct again, 3 vehicles, at least 3. German tanks, not trucks, not half-tracks. The situation formed in his mind with brutal clarity. They needed to cross this road to continue toward friendly lines. The Germans were already on it. If they moved now, they would drive directly into a head-on encounter at close range. If they stayed, they risked being discovered. Either option carried risk, but one offered a chance. Morrison made the decision before anyone could question it. "We wait," he signaled. The column remained still, and the sound grew louder. The road that could have ended everything by 4:12 a.m. The German tanks reached the junction, and for the first time that night, Thompson could see the enemy clearly, not as distant shapes or imagined threats, but as real, moving machines passing through the same space they needed to cross. And the sight was enough to drive home just how fragile their situation truly was. 3 Panther tanks rolled into view, their silhouettes massive even in the dim pre-dawn light, long-barreled guns extending forward like warnings. Their armor sloped and angular in a way that made the Sherman feel suddenly small and vulnerable by comparison. They moved with confidence, at speed, their engines producing that distinctive Maybach growl that Thompson had learned to recognize instantly. And as the lead Panther passed within 200 yards of their position, he could see the commander standing in the hatch, scanning forward with binoculars, completely unaware of the 12 American tanks hidden in the tree line just beyond his field of vision. Every instinct in Thompson's body told him how dangerous this moment was, because at that distance, if even one of those German crews turned their heads slightly, if even one glint of metal or movement caught their attention, the result would be immediate and catastrophic. The Panthers would stop, pivot, and fire before the Shermans could react, their superior guns punching through American armor at a range where return fire would barely matter. There would be no maneuver, no tactical response, just destruction. Inside the tank, Webb sat frozen at the controls, his breathing shallow, controlled by force of will, while Diaz kept his hand on the turret controls without moving. Every man in the crew understanding without words that survival depended entirely on remaining invisible for just a few more seconds. The first Panther passed, then the second, then the third. Each one moving through the junction without slowing, without suspicion, continuing west along the road, as if the forest around them was empty, as if the war existed somewhere else entirely. The sound of their engines began to fade, gradually dissolving into the distance until it became nothing more than a low hum. And still Morrison waited, holding the column in place, counting time in silence to ensure the patrol was far enough away to reduce the risk of detection. 2 minutes passed. It felt like 10. Then Morrison gave the signal, "Move." The release of tension was immediate but controlled, the Sherman rolling forward onto the road, its treads crunching against gravel that sounded far too loud in Thompson's ears, followed quickly by the rest of the column, each tank crossing the junction in sequence, forming a line along the road that stretched back into the forest. For the first time since the mission had begun, they were moving on terrain designed for vehicles, smooth and direct, allowing Webb to increase speed gradually, pushing the tank up to 20 kilometers per hour, a pace that felt almost reckless compared to the careful crawling they had done for hours. They moved east along the road, following Morrison's revised plan, the direction now based on real landmarks rather than uncertain readings, and for a brief stretch it felt like they might actually make it, that the worst was behind them, that the combination of luck, improvisation, and discipline had carried them through the most dangerous part of the journey. But that feeling didn't last, because war had a way of reminding you that survival was never guaranteed until it was over. At 4:29 a.m., the road split, a fork, left to right. The map Morrison had studied indicated that the left path led toward American lines near Aachen, while the right led deeper into German-controlled supply routes, and the decision had to be made instantly because slowing down here, hesitating in the open, increased the risk of being seen by any patrol moving along the same roads they were now using. Thompson raised his hand, signaling left, and Webb turned the Sherman smoothly onto the rising path, the rest of the column following without question, the entire formation committing once again to a direction that had to be right. The road began to climb, a long, gradual incline that forced the engines to work harder. The Sherman's diesel straining as Webb pushed the throttle forward, trying to maintain speed despite the slope. And Thompson glanced down at the fuel gauge, watching the needle drop lower, now dangerously close to empty, the realization hitting him with renewed urgency that they were running out of time in more ways than one. Dawn was approaching faster now, the eastern sky shifting from black to a faint gray that hinted at the light to come, and with that light would come visibility, exposure, the end of whatever concealment they had relied on all night. Morrison's voice came over the radio, firm, decisive. "Increase speed. We need to reach friendly lines before daylight."
Webb didn't hesitate. The Sherman accelerated, pushing toward 30 kilometers per hour despite the risk, the tank rattling slightly as it moved faster than the terrain comfortably allowed, the rest of the column matching the pace, 12 tanks racing against the rising sun and the limits of their fuel. At 4:43 a.m., Thompson saw it. A roadblock
Logs stacked across the road, barbed wire, sandbag positions on either side. For a moment everything slowed because he couldn't tell what it was, American or German. The difference between the two meant life or death, and from this distance, in this light, there was no clear answer. Morrison's voice came through again, one word: pray. The Sherman didn't slow. There was no time, no alternative. They drove straight toward the roadblock, every man and every tank bracing for what might happen next, for gunfire, for movement, for any sign that would reveal who controlled that position. But nothing came, no shots, no movement, no resistance. As they closed the distance, the details became clearer. The shape of the fortifications, the layout of the positions, and then, finally, the realization hit: American-friendly. The relief that followed wasn't loud, wasn't celebrated. It was quiet, almost disbelieving, because after everything they had been through, after hours of uncertainty and near misses and decisions that could have gone wrong in 100 different ways, they had made it. At 4:47 a.m., the column passed through the roadblock, 12 Sherman tanks, 63 men, alive, 17 minutes before sunrise. And with that, the night that should have ended in disaster instead became something else entirely, a story of survival balanced on the edge of failure, of decisions made with incomplete information, of a compass that had both guided and misled them, and of a line between life and death that had been crossed without anyone realizing just how close they had come to falling on the wrong side of it. The luck that no one could explain. At 5:03 a.m., just minutes before sunrise, Thompson's Sherman rolled into American lines and came to a stop, followed by the rest of the column, and for a moment no one spoke because the silence felt unreal after everything they had just survived. When Webb tried to restart the engine, it failed. The fuel was completely gone, proving they had made it back with nothing left to spare. 63 men stepped out alive, not because everything had gone right, but because nothing had gone wrong at the final moment. Later, Captain Morrison filed the report, reducing the entire night into a few calm sentences about compass failure and improvised navigation. But what those words couldn't capture was how close they had come to driving straight into a German encampment, or how the very compass they trusted had actually been wrong. Thompson kept that compass, knowing the truth. It hadn't saved them by being perfect. It had saved them by failing at exactly the right time. In the end, it wasn't just about a device. It was about a decision, a risk taken in the dark with no certainty. No guarantee, just enough judgment and just enough luck. 12 tanks, 63 men, and one wrong direction that somehow led them home.